Hello and good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome on this rather cold morning on behalf of the World Economic Forum and our dear partners, the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Chatham House. In today's session, we'll talk about constructive solutions that already exist or need to be conjured to move the needle on circularity through trade. We have an exciting agenda filled for you today with two panels with a lot of experts from the industry, academia, and a variety of other fields. But before that, please allow me to say that I'm absolutely honored to welcome our keynote speaker, Her Highness Sheikh Shamma bin Sultan bin Khalifa Al Nahyan, who wears many impressive hats, including being the president and CEO of the UAE Independent Climate Change Accelerator. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests. I'd like to thank the World Circular Economy Forum for inviting me to speak today. The transition towards a circular economy begins with our commitment to the planet, to people, and to ourselves. It is recognition of our responsibility to care for the environment around us, for the betterment of our lives and those of generations to come. As we face the triple planetary crisis, we acknowledge it is an intimidating endeavor. And what we often identify as indicators of sustainability, acronyms like ESG, lists of KPIs, can sometimes strip away the humanity of our mission. And when we speak broadly of the economy, industry, and infrastructure, it can be easy to disconnect from what is being discussed. But the irony is, circular economy solutions are arguably the most inherent and natural to our planet and to us as humans. In pausing for a moment to consider the transition from a linear to a circular economy, the regenerative properties of the earth, the abundance of materials, the life-forming resources are ever present. We have strayed far from this system, and it is somewhat encouraging to not think of the work being done as a complete transformation, but rather a process of getting us back on track. The realities of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss are confronting and often feel insurmountable, but we can be guided by a simple sentiment. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. So let's start where we are. Today, we need circular societies, including education, resource, mobility. These solutions should be designed to sustain the progress we make and have purpose at every phase of action. Currently, we face great disparity between the value of circular trade and the opportunities of the global north and global south in terms of representation, financial gains, and economic development. We must not get lost in the complexity of this space and remain steadfast on the ethics and true intentions in circular trade. Our focus must remain on making the best use of what we have and empowering the next generation to do better. What we have in abundance is creativity, ambition, and determination. This is particularly evident amongst our youth, which I have had the privilege of witnessing firsthand. Take, for example, peak mobility, one of the innovations in the UICCA's accelerator program, whose 23-year-old CEO is building a solution to advance the petrol to electricity transition. Zach Faisal and his team are working to repurpose retired vehicles to give them a new life and keep them operating in the economy. As the UICCA, we recognize how impactful these tools, intentions, and efforts can be if they have the right support and environment to thrive. In the case of peak mobility, we are working hand in hand with this ambitious startup to ensure the right policies are in place to enable their growth within the UAE and beyond. Another shining example of a youth-led organization that is committed to driving this agenda forward is Rebound, which is focused on creating a plastics exchange program in 140 countries. At the helm stands a young Emirati lady called Mariam al-Mansouri, who I had the pleasure of meeting just last week. Our discussions centered around the challenges faced in facilitating a successful transition to a circular economy and the role the recycling industry places in unlocking the opportunity around trading waste. In the words of Mariam, I quote, "Moving from a linear to circular economy means leaders need to be brave enough to do things differently and have an appetite to try, instead of simply taking action. These companies need to see that environmental impact is as valuable as profitability." End quote. There is immense wisdom in these words that we as leaders in the public and private sector can greatly benefit from. As leaders, we must recognize the unique perspectives and skill sets our youth can bring to the table. In turn, it is our responsibility to nurture these innovative insights and create platforms that teach and refine business fundamentals that can set them up to succeed. Most importantly, it is essential that we stand shoulder to shoulder with our future leaders to address the challenges we collectively face. For they create real, measurable, tangible change. And just like each of us, they're led by an innate and powerful commitment to environmental protection. They take climate action. We know what must be done, and as implored by Mariam, I hope you will make a commitment with me today to be brave. I would like to once again express my gratitude to you and the World Circular Economy Forum for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for warming up the room and also for the insightful insights that you shared. We now move on to our first panel, bringing together actors from a variety of value chains and who are actually pushing the pedal very hard, like Your Highness shared, on circular trade on a day-to-day basis. I'm very happy to have with us today Becky Taylor, Business Development Director at Caterpillar, Julie Kiestrook, Head of Policy and Thought Leadership at Velux, Phil Brown, Director at Metabolic Institute, and Jori Arvonen, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Swappy. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll hear their circular trade stories, how they're really trying hard to square the circle, and let everyone know that these solutions do exist, and we need to communicate certain things to our policymakers to make this a scaled effort. Phil, maybe I'm going to start with you. You are some sort of a big expert on traceability, but to me, at least, that word is a bit new. So why don't you start by saying why is traceability critical to circular trade? And things like blockchain, how can they contribute?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you, Jeet, also for the element of being an expert on this space, because I think traceability is very, very new topic. It's also very against our common way of doing business, because what does traceability mean? It means also linking transparency. And when you combine these things together, we get very worried and very concerned, because there's a lot of sensitive information that we don't traditionally like to share, but we need to. So if I focus firstly on traceability, what do we mean by that? Now, my title here says Director of Metabolic Institute, which is true. I've recently transitioned to Metabolic, but I was also working previously at circularity, which is a blockchain-based supply chain tracking company. I'm still actually advising them as well. What they were trying to do was create end-to-end traceability from source material all the way through to finished product and beyond. So all of the different R strategies, reuse, refurb, reman, etc. Now, traceability in that process of end-to-end requires each actor sharing what have they done with the material, how have they produced the product, where have they produced it, have they used materials that should be handled in a certain way under certain conditions, vis-a-vis batteries, for instance. And all of this traceability requires a lot of data to be shared across the value chain, so that at each point, each actor has the information that they need to do their job. We have people here who are doing iPhone and, well, as core remanufacturing. They need very specific information to do their job and to do it efficiently. Traditionally, everything was siloed. We have all of this data in our ERP systems. What traceability ERP, enterprise resource programs, if any of you, sorry, acronyms. But if we don't have that data at the right point, you really can't actually start to facilitate trade or remanufacturing or circular strategies or all of those other points. On the second point, how can blockchain or other technologies help? So blockchain is basically an open ledger. If you really boil it down, it's a ledger that everyone can share. Now, there are some complexities to it. You can have open blockchains, closed blockchains, different varieties. But if you focus on that open ledger element, that means if I make an edit, then Yuri can see that I've made an edit, but then also Julie can see, and so can Becky. So we can all see that the data has been edited, and we can all have a little bit more trust. Now, this then comes to that transparency question, which is the other side of traceability. But I'll go back to the technology side, because there are many other technologies, such as AI, anything related to digital. We can make it very easy for this, well, easy in inverted commas, because the challenge is if we do it by paper and do it by traditional systems, it's going to become a burden to everyone. I think I went a little bit beyond your question, but was that?
No, thanks a lot. I mean, I asked for it. Caterpillar, Becky, they're, like everyone knows, they're one of the pioneers in the remanufacturing sphere. But there's still a lot of confusion about what that term really means. Why don't you start us by describing what remanufacturing actually means, how it's different from, let's say, recycling or repair or any of the other Res?
All right. So with CAT remanufacturing, so it is not rebuilding, it's not recycling, repairing, it's not refurbishing, it's not overhauls or even downcycling. So if you look at the differences, first let's look at like a rebuild, for example. In a rebuild situation, you're doing an inspection process, you're cleaning, and then you're really replacing that worn or damaged part. From a refurbishing standpoint, you're taking a look at the physical inspection. Externally, you're looking at an internal examination, and with that, you are doing a cleaning process there of cleaning the buildup of the parts, and then you're reassembling it and doing basic testing. Now with CAT remanufacturing, for example, really how this process works. So what we do is it really starts with us selling a CAT reman product to our customers. And then our customers bring back that used component, or what we like to call core, back to our Caterpillar dealerships, who will do an inspection process, and then from there, they're sending it back to Caterpillar. And when it comes to us, and it comes to our remanufacturing facilities, we're doing a full disassembly of those components, breaking them down to its individual piece parts, where now that component is losing its identity. And we're going through a cleaning process, we're inspecting that product, and it's going through salvage processes as well. And then it gets remanufactured with the, just like a new OEM performance and quality inspections. And with that, it has also the most latest and greatest engineering specifications. So with that product in itself, it also has the same as new warranty and at a lower cost for those customers as well when they're bringing back that exchange.
Thanks a lot. I think this goes on to show how important these definitions really are at the very beginning of our journey on circular trade. Julie, I'm going to pass to you. Velux has recently reinforced its commitment to circularity across the value chain. Given the markets that you operate, what sort of challenges or roadblocks do you see ahead? And what's more interesting for me is, what's your game plan?
Our game plan. So first of all, many thanks for inviting me here. I'm from Velux, and for those of you who don't know us, we produce rooftop windows. So we're basically working on fresh air and daylight. So those are really positive and nice topics, I think, to work on. So for us, circular economy is really sort of a toolbox for us to achieve our decarbonization reduction targets. And it's a prerequisite, really, for our industry to meet that. And that's why, for us, it's really important to decouple our resource use from the value generation. And seeing that we're also planning to grow quite substantially in the years to come, that is quite a big commitment. We're committed to being carbon neutral in scopes 1 and 2 by 2030 and halving scope 3 by 50%. So, game plan. It's basically built around 3 pillars. So it's governance, courage, going to what Her Highness talked about as well, and partnerships. Strong governance because this is complicated. I mean, here we are, a group of committed people at a conference full of committed people, and still it is just not easy, right? It's a process that touches all aspects of the company, and that's why it's really important to have a clear plan with actions and also to have the leader and ownership internally across the different functions. And so we've been working really hard on that at Velux in the last year. The second point, importantly, is courage, because we don't have all the solutions today, and we will need to come up with some new solutions and also explore areas that maybe we haven't been in touch with before. So you need to lean out the window, you need to explore, you need to also take the time to find the right solutions for your business. And finally, and super important for us, partnerships, because we need to work together to find the right solutions, and because circularity requires a systemic approach, understanding the ecosystem around us, both upstream and downstream. And just to give you an example, I said we're going to halve our scope 3 emissions by 2030. 98.6% of our emissions today are in scope 3, according to our latest sustainability report. And 57% of those are the materials in our products. So that's the bulk of our efforts. And so what we've done and started doing this year is to do strategic partnerships with manufacturers of metals, in this case, so aluminium and steel, so that we can source lower carbon metals for our products. And these products are lower carbon because they are partly recycled and also because they are produced with renewable sources. So I think it's a really good example of how we need to work together to meet our common targets. Then in terms of the obstacles, and there are many, and I think we've talked a little bit about them already, for us it's basically the frame around what we're doing. So it's making sure we have the right methodologies in place, that we're very clear on what constitutes the recycled product, what are the warranties, what about the harmonized technical language, how can we make sure that a company such as ours can get good access to these secondary raw materials and these refurbished materials so that we can use them in a way that makes sense. And that also, because we're also a business, still leaves us competitive. And for that, we really need a policy framework.
Thanks a lot, Julian. Good luck on your game plan. And thanks also for getting me started on two very important words, refurbishing and competitive. That actually brings us to our fourth panelist. Yuri, as you know, is leading a startup that has been the fastest growing company in Europe for over 3 years. That's no small feat, and in itself merits a moment. A circular company has been topping the charts. But let's focus, let's shift the gears somewhat and talk about what are the key choke points now that you have been growing so fast. In terms of your further growth, what roadblocks do you see?
Thank you, Jeet. So I'm from Swappy, and we do refurbish devices, so we give a new life to smartphones. And when we look at how that growth has come about and how we want to take it to the next level, it's not kind of enough to just look at our company, but it's really the industry as a whole that's being held back by certain things. Because in the end, how many devices you can refurbish and bring back to the market is driven by two things. So how long is the device actually usable, that's not obsolete, and how easy and cheap is it to repair? That actually makes sense to repair it. So when you look at these two pieces, so how long is the device usable? The key part is how long do you have software support? If there's one more year of software support for the smartphone, you're going to have that many more devices that are going to have a life. When you look at the second part, how cheap is it to repair? That's actually even harder, because if the repair is just a fraction of the price of a new device, it will be repaired. You will go over, you'll have it repaired, and you'll get your device back and it has a new life. But if the repair is more expensive than a new device, you will always buy the new device. So this is a big challenge. How do you actually make the repairs cheap? And for us, the answer is markets. It's really third parties that can provide both spare parts and third parties that can do repairs. If it's only one player that's doing repairs and the original manufacturer doing the repairs and sharing the spare parts, it's not going to have a market. It's not going to actually have volume and scale. So this third party is really important. And that's something where we've actually seen a lot of hurdles lately. So original manufacturers have been introducing things like part pairing, where if you have two smartphones and you swap components on them, they will not function properly anymore. And it's just because they're trying to make it harder for third parties to participate in the market. And if you actually want a thriving circular economy, you need third parties in the mix.
Thanks a lot. I think that was a really good first round because we got to know a lot about the companies, we got to know a lot about what they're dabbling in. Julia, I'm going to come back to you. Given the scale of the building sector, we all know it's a huge sector with a lot of footprint. What, according to you, are the low-hanging fruits in terms of going circular through trade?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, the scale is enormous, as you say. Depending on who you ask, it's about in Europe, about 40% of all energy used goes into the construction of or running of the building stock, and about a third of the carbon emissions. So it also means that there is no way that we're going to decarbonize if you don't tackle the building sector. Now, low-hanging fruits, an optimistic term, I think, because I think we just concluded that it is not easy. But I think it is really about sort of creating like a good market for secondary materials, and that in turn rests on having like a global sort of frame of sort of harmonized standards, so that we all know what we're buying, what we can use it for, and where the liability is across the chain. But also, I think more than sort of looking at thought examples, I'm going to give you an example of what we've done at Velux. One of the things we've done is decided we want to be plastic-free and single source in our packaging by 2030. And so far, we're about 90% in terms of reducing our plastic use. And that has been, again, it's a good example of something that seems relatively straightforward, but actually involves all parts of the company. But by only using cardboard, it's easier and more efficient to recycle plastic. It requires less sorting and separation, both on our end, but also, very importantly, the builders on the build. We can reuse it several times, and also from our end, by only using one product, it makes our sourcing much easier. We are sourcing one material, so that becomes more cost-effective and less complex. And so we have huge environmental benefits out of this. That's why we're doing it. But I think it's a good example of how something like that, which we didn't actually think was going to be a financial benefit, has also led to a streamlining of our processes in terms of our resourcing and therefore our ability to run a cost-effective business. And so what we're doing now is to look at other material streams to again see if we can reduce them, to reduce complexity and cost, but also at the same time to lower the environmental footprint. So I think my point is you just need to get started with these products and projects.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and apologies for the toxic positivity and too much optimism. But I do realize it's going to be difficult. Yuri, I think you talked about market development. Julie also touched on market development. What would your message be in that case to trade policymakers to expand refurbishment and maybe even circular trade in electronics?
That's a really good question. So I think when you look at policymakers, it's a hard job to make sure that there's appropriate policy for this. And like circular economy is bringing a lot of benefits. You get jobs, less e-waste, saving on carbon, but you need to do the work. And in our case, it's really about refurbishment. Refurbishment needs to be treated separately from new devices or just remanufacturing as well. So it needs to have its own scheme and its own rules. And this is a big challenge. You need to do the work to actually get the results. And another kind of queer point is the fact that quite often policymakers reach out to the original manufacturers to discuss how we should do circular economy and how we should do this development. And you're really asking a company that's directly competing with the refurbished product for insights on how to build the circular parts. It's actually a bit weird, because in the end, every phone that gets a new life through a repair and every phone that's being refurbished and reintroduced into the market is actually one less new phone being sold. So it's good to reach out to refurbishers when you're working on policies to do refurbishment. And what we really need are these ways to limit the control of the original manufacturer on the device and the third-party spare parts that are going to happen after the sale. So this is really what we need, and I hope we can get there.
Thanks a lot. And thanks also for pointing that quirk out. And I actually had a lot of fun with that question, so I'm going to ask the same thing to you, Becky. You work on in a lot of countries across borders. What is your message going to be to trade policymakers? How can they make your job easier in enabling remanufactured trade?
So first of all, with Caterpillar, we have over 8,000 remanufactured products today. So it's a misconception. A lot of times people think that we only remanufacture engines, but in fact we remanufacture engines, engine blocks, cylinder heads, hydraulics, electronics, and more. So drivetrain, another example. So with that, remanufacturing is an enabler for the circular economy. So, and in order to have that ability to be able to do that, it is critical that we have the free flow of our core and our remanufactured products across borders. Now, with that, there's many countries today that actually do allow for free flow of the core and remanufactured products, and those countries and those citizens are able to benefit from contributing to the circular economy, as well as getting a product that is a lower cost product with the exchange of the core and having a like new performance product as well. Then there's other countries that have those restrictions and don't have the free flow. So they're missing out on some of the opportunities of all the various different repair options. So with that, though, with countries that are looking to make some changes to their policies and their adjustments, what they can do is either lift those regulations or they can make adjustments to those policies in regards to remanufacturing. With that, there's many examples out there, and if they are going to be making those changes, I would highly suggest that they really understand the process better. In order to do that, the best thing to do would be to go to a remanufacturing facility and see the full end-to-end process firsthand. However, many times you can't possibly maybe go to one of those facilities, and if not, there's many examples out there that will help in order to better understand. So there is the APIC Pathfinder initiative that has clear definitions around remanufacturing, and there's 13 different economies out there today that support that initiative. There is also the US, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, and there's also the ISO that is being created around the circular economy. So many examples today that people can start off from rather than starting from scratch.
Thanks a lot. I really hope that message reaches wherever you want it to reach. Phil, I'm going to come back to you with another question on traceability. What are the common pitfalls to be aware of? Because now we have heard a lot of talking around digital product passports as an enabler of traceability. What are the things to keep in mind before deploying that?
Well, I'd actually say that some of the other panelists, actually most notably Julie and Becky, have just said some of these challenges. So 90-odd% of Scope 3 is in the upchain. There is no defined methodology for Scope 3 emissions yet. ISO is working on something. Yes, Pathfinder frameworks are out there. But what happens if 4 of my upstream partners use Pathfinder and 4 of my partners use ISO standards? They're different. They have different assumptions. And yet I want to create a Scope 3. So the interoperability of the method is one challenge. The other problem that I see commonly is the interoperability of systems. If you go back to your home organizations and ask how many of your systems speak to each other within your own company, and speak to your IT team and ask them how long the backlog is. And then we can have a talk probably in about 2026, and then really figure out how do you start to share that across the value chain. So I think Julie put forward the challenge that they have to do it very wide collaboration. Now that's not with the traditional partners. Those are probably 4 or 5 actors removed. You have to go, you said aluminium. Okay, great. Have you understood their language before? So interoperability of systems, language, and even the mindset. I believe it was described earlier as well by Her Highness. The fact to have the courage to try this, to step out of your usual circle. That's really hard. So data systems as well, infrastructure. But if we look at the digitization wave, the first wave of digitization, we had open protocols. If any of you typed in World Circular Economy Forum, what happens? You get HTTP://. That's a protocol that every website follows to say, okay, if you're making a website, these are the rules of the game. Think of email. None of you have ever asked anyone before you send an email, hey, are you using Outlook, Gmail, Yahoo, Apple, whatever? No, because they follow the IMAP and SMTP protocols. That was first wave of innovation for digital. Then we had the second wave where it was platformatization. Go to an MBA school at the moment, they'll talk to you about platformatization till the cows come home. And that's all about creating this locked-in system. But look what's happened. We've created Silicon Valley with billionaires who have more money than anyone can ever imagine to spend. So if we want to create circular trade and a system that is fair and a system that can transfer information from one end, from the global south to the global north, it needs to be open. So policymakers need to really say, if you're going to have these systems, yes, you can have your closed system at home, but when you're sharing this to facilitate transfer of data that needs to be trusted, because remember, why are we doing all of this with DPPs? So a consumer can say, this product is made in this way versus this product. Now, if they can't access that data because it's behind a paywall, is anyone going to do it? Now, my concern is if we don't use this window of opportunity to show all of the good work that these companies are doing here, consumers will lose their, willingness to pay for a higher, potentially higher product. And if you erode that confidence, then we can probably see the sustainable transition taking a slower pace, because it's the consumers at the end who are going to drive that by demanding it. But if they buy and pay premium for product that is not accurate and they can't assess the data, or it's hidden, or it's behind paywalls, they're not going to speak with their money, and they're going to actually probably speak with their feet and go elsewhere. The other thing that I see about inclusivity is really the power dynamics. So actually, again, Julie was mentioning this about collaborating, but you don't come in as Velux and go, we're Velux, we're going to do this. It's more like, how can we work together? So these are some of the challenges and pitfalls I see. So be brave, open up to collaborate, put your cards on the table, and do it openly. Don't say, sign this NDA, and by the way, behind this paywall, I have all of this really interesting data. Just share. Be more confident about what you're doing, and yeah, you'll see some magic happen, in my view. Just my view.
Thanks, Alfred. That was very inspired. I'm going to move on to the last round of questions, and that's going to be a rapid fire. I'm just stuck with you in an elevator. We don't have a lot of time, so Yuri, I'm going to start with you. What are the special considerations for supply chain for spare parts? Because I imagine you depend a lot on that, given that you're a circular value chain.
Yeah, I think here, again, we're kind of coming back to the same topic that I've been covering a bit in previous comments as well, that in the end, what we need are third-party spare parts, because that's really where things work out. The original manufacturer is making sure that their spare parts stay in their network, and they decide the prices. And if we want to have competition and actually replacing spare parts, you need flexible spare part access. And we really need to get to a place where it's respectable to be a third-party spare part provider. If you look at car tires, it's not like if you buy Michelin tires to your Toyota car, you're a bad person. But if you buy a third-party battery to your phone is going to say, this is dangerous, stop it, you're doing something, warning, warning. So here again, we need to do this differently, and it's really important to get that right.
Thanks, Yuri. Thanks for also sort of keeping in time. Becky, I run into in Chicago. We just have 30 seconds. Which country examples are you going to give me that are doing really great and others can maybe learn from and adapt?
I would say that, well, first of all, there's many countries today that are talking about the circular economy, which is great, and really trying to understand and put remanufacturing in their agreements. And so one of them is the ASEAN economic ministers. So they are looking at their free trade agreement and trying to put some better understanding around remanufacturing in that. And so they are bringing in companies like Caterpillar to give examples and to help them better understand so that they know what exactly to put in there. One other example, Mexico. So they, when they bring in used parts, they actually bring it into a bonded area. They have 1 HTS then for remanufactured products. And so what this does is this helps to avoid having used parts come into the country. They're actually bringing it in to make sure that it is being remanufactured in the end.
Thanks a lot. Julie, knowing
2 seconds.
we can use 1 more minute and 30 seconds each for the two of you. For a more circular building sector, like we said, that's the goal we are going towards. What should trade policymakers do for us?
They should set ambitious standards. And then I've already said harmonise a number of times, and I'll say it again, because what we really need, you talked about as well, we need like a common harmonised language, circularity, right? We need to know where we're going. We need to know what the goals are. And we need to make sure we have legislation in place that supports that. And now you said trade policymakers, but I think the important thing is that there are so many people here across different departments, across different countries that have a stake. And all of this legislation on carbon, on energy, on circularity, it needs to form a whole, because otherwise we're being pulled in this direction by that legislation and then in this direction by the other, and that's where we're then sat in the middle, unable to really lucrate on the benefits.
Thanks a lot. Phil, last question for people like me who didn't go to an MBA school. What advice do you have for emerging countries to benefit from traceability tech?
I neither did go to an MBA school either. So for emerging countries, I mean, if we look at where a lot of the base materials are coming from, so for instance, if I look at natural rubbers, it's coming from BRIC countries. And traceability of that is really important. How can they benefit from this? By really proving where their materials are from and the working practices that they are, because there are buyers for those materials, and there is a premium for those materials currently. If I'm a brand and an OEM and I can prove that those materials have been sourced correctly, we worked on a project at Circularize within Indonesia, actually, which was using waste pickers on beaches, so ocean cleanup. They were given a GPS tagger, they were given a fair wage. That was then traced all the way through into the end product. I can't mention the brand, but they paid a very high premium for that because they were able to provide all of the information about, I mean, you even saw the ticket stub, you saw a picture of the person, where they'd even cleaned the beach, etc. So there are new business models available in this, but it's also a bit of a threat if you just go for the power dynamics that I mentioned before. So it needs to also be done within a sense that's fair and equitable. This is where ethics come in and business practices, but 30 seconds is up.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. And let's have a big round of applause for our first round of panelists as they go back to their seats. And we've actually heard a lot of interesting insights. We have heard a lot about why traceability matters, what's in it for developing countries, spare parts supply chains, that's enormously important for refurbishers and remanufacturers, and the need for incentives and legal requirements. And this last one actually segues really nicely to our next panel on concrete trade policy opportunities. I'd like to welcome our two dear colleagues for this. Gail Kruby, we have you first, the Deputy Director of Tariffs and Trade Affairs at the World Customs Organization, and Nicholas Lockhart, who's a partner at Sidley Austin. Welcome. I'm going to come closer to you. So we at my team and I at the World Economic Forum, we have been hammering away at the circular trade problem for a while now. And we came up with 3 very concrete solution areas, as we call them. The first one is, of course, like our panelists mentioned here, creating markets for circular goods and services. How do you increase and promote trade in them? The second one, as Becky very nicely explained, how do you promote and enable trade in remanufactured, refurbished, repaired goods across borders? And the third one is trusted trader schemes. How do you accelerate or facilitate trade of end-of-life products for the circular economy? And these two experts that I have with us today will kind of zoom in on each of these areas. Maybe I should start with you, Gail, on the first one. We need to accelerate trade in goods and services that are good for the circular economy. Given your expertise, what can we concretely do to encourage such trade?
Okay, well, this is a very, very broad question. And of course, there's a full range of needs right through from that important first step of creating that shared vision and understanding, right down to the specific measures you want to implement. But I'm from customs, so customs are very practical, so I'm going to start with some very practical issues here. And part of our work in customs administrations is to implement a range of policy across government for anything that affects the border and goods going through it. So while we need to do that, what we need to do is have that basic understanding of the definitions. So when you're talking about facilitating goods that are good for the circular economy, what are these? How do we define these? Because we need to know what we need to facilitate. We need to know what we need to apply these measures to. And with this, in terms of how you want to do it, I think the thing with this is that depending on the customs administration's capacity, because customs administration's capacities around the world will vary depending on what facilities they have available to them in their country. So we need to know how we can actually do this. So apart from the definition, we need to look at creating a range of possibilities. So what do you actually want to do? Do you want to apply fiscal facilitation? Do you want to apply ease of trade? Do you want to apply labelling? And we can tailor then our approaches to make that happen. So we can go from the full range from a very, very flexible, but not necessarily very stringent, like self-declaration that this is a circular product, right through to probably the most powerful method, which is putting things in the harmonised system, which is the global classification of goods. It gives you worldwide consistency, but it's actually quite difficult because there are fairly stringent requirements to do that. And in between of this, of course, you've got a whole range of options, everything from putting provisions into free trade agreements being negotiated, using licensing or certification schemes, creating labelling requirements, implementing measures through taxation administrations, so behind borders, and providing practical support to circular economies, enterprises, and of course, let's not forget consumer education, actually helping people understand why this is important. But the underlying foundation of getting all of this is having that shared vision of what you mean and having those shared definitions.
Thanks a lot. And we come back to definitions. And that was very practical, Gail. Speaking of, Nick, you work a lot with trade policymakers. What do they need to know to be good students of what Gail just mentioned?
Thanks very much, Jeet. Good morning, everybody. I am a partner with a law firm, but I work with many governments on trade and sustainability matters, as well as with many companies. And I wanted to just sort of step back, actually, a little bit, reflecting also on the discussion that we had a moment ago. So in terms of kind of trade policy for circularity, there are tons of ideas that are emerging from civil society. There is loads of energy in the circular economy community, and lots of ideas on how to turn that line into a circle. What I think we need in order to try to transform trade policy to make it work better for circular solutions is for that community to help trade officials. So at the WTO and in the trade world, the circular economy is still something of an esoteric topic, and trade officials are still kind of learning to walk, I think, in terms of their understanding about circularity. What would really help, I think, is understanding that process and taking a little bit of time to work with them. And in the first session, we heard a lot of very concrete ideas about what business needs. And I think to move the needle forwards, what we need is engagement with trade officials on some of these very concrete ideas. So what trade officials, I think, find difficult is dealing with kind of abstract, open-ended ideas and options. And what is much easier for them to work with is a set of kind of concrete proposals. And there were a number of concrete proposals that were made in the earlier session that I think could help move the needle. We heard about the need to create incentives, but we heard that from each of those companies, the types of incentives that you need depend very much on the business model and the sector. So kind of general ideas are not so helpful. I would say what we need is sort of thinking very specifically about particular sectors and what they need and how to move the needle forward for them. We heard the need for harmonized standards, but of course that will then depend upon the sector and the particular product. We also, I think, need to bear in mind that trade policy is not just at the border, so customs, what Gail was talking about, but it's also in-market regulation. And it's finding the right mix of incentives to enable us to create incentives for circularity and to turn that line into a circle.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Nick. And I know you said it's not just at the border, but for the moment, Gail, I would like to ask you a question on the border bit of it. We heard really inspiring stories from both Becky and Yuri on remanufacturing and refurbishing. But when these kind of goods come in through the border, what are the things that should be kept in mind? How can these be identified, or what are the pitfalls, rather, to be aware of?
Well, you use the key words, how do we identify these? So if we're looking at anything that's going to be implemented at the border, identification is key. And if you think about it, you've got these goods coming through, you have someone that's standing at a customs port and they're looking at a container of goods, or they're at the airport looking at goods coming through. How do they verify that these goods meet any measures you put in? So what is our definition of remanufactured, and what will give that key? Is it, the condition of goods? Is it the presence of a verifiable as new warranty? I mean, how do you want to define these at the borders? And I think it's been mentioned before, there are a lot of non-tariff barriers to remanufactured goods. So I think getting that shared understanding of what it is and how we can verify it is key. And I'm probably more focused on this because my area is the harmonised system, the international language of trade, and we are all about identification. So when someone comes to us and say, we want you to create a separate provision for remanufactured goods, we say, fantastic, we're happy to look at this. Now this is going to become part of law in all these countries, and it's going to have to be verifiable in courts if necessary, so how do we prove it? So this is the sort of thing that we would be looking at. So if you're coming in, think about how these could be defined at the border and separated from goods that are for disposal or simple reuse, if they're for remanufacturing, so to speak. How can you make sure that these are truly either A, remanufactured goods, or goods coming in for remanufacture? And the second one is probably the hardest, because sadly, environmental crime is incredibly lucrative. And that's a terrible, terrible thing in our world at the moment. There's a lot of money to be made by criminals in dumping waste. So how do we ensure, if we're talking about the other side of remanufacturing goods coming in for remanufacture, that these are not going to be diverted? So these are really practical questions we have to ask. And I think a lot of time when we're having policy discussions, people think it's too early to think about things like this. But if you don't think about these things early, then often you end up with policy that's either too vague or it's too stringent and tends to miss out too much of the opportunities for developing the trade. So do it in parallel.
Thanks a lot. And I think some of these challenges that you mentioned at the border might be more magnified for developing countries. And I think Phil also touched upon some of the opportunities that might come up from the circular transition. And definitely part of our work at the World Economic Forum has also been to ensure how development cooperation and trade cooperation can help the circular transition in developing countries. Because we do not want a two-speed transition where there's a circular divide between the two sets of countries. Nick, I'm going to ask you a question related to this. How do you think trade cooperation can address some of the concerns that developing countries might have? And I'm going to stay within the repair, remanufacturing, refurbishing remit, and you can be more specific based on the different issues.
Thanks, Jeet. Yeah, this is a really important question. I mean, I think we probably all agree that the goal that we're trying to achieve is a global circular economy. There's no point, and it's probably impossible even to have circular economy in Europe, for example. And we want that transition to that global circular economy to be just, fair, and inclusive. So the position of developing countries, I think, is really important. And I have three observations about where we are today in that transition to a just, fair, and inclusive global circular economy. And these really reflect some of the concerns that I've heard expressed by developing countries in the trade community about trade solutions for circularity. The first of those concerns is that within the circular community, I think there is a tendency for us to look for solutions that are somewhat northern focused, if I can put it in those terms. That there isn't enough attention being paid to the challenges of the global south in the circular transition. We heard from the companies that spoke a few minutes ago that from their perspective, the circular transition needs to be tailor-made to their sector, to their interests, to their industry, to their model. But when you step back to a country level, it's the same thing. There is no one-size-fits-all. Circular solutions have to be tailor-made for companies, for markets, for countries, for regions. And the position of developing countries is very different from developed countries. So what works, for example, in the EU, will not necessarily and is unlikely to work in many other parts of the world. The second point is what Jeet just mentioned about two-speed markets. And so for second life goods, and I'm going to use that term without defining it, for second life goods, there are concerns about there being two-speed markets where developing countries become home for second life goods. And from a sustainable development perspective, that raises questions for each of the three pillars. It raises questions about social fairness. It raises environmental questions, because these are goods with an inherently shorter lifespan and they're in places with less capacity to dispose. But it also raises questions about economic development. And I'll share with you something that a delegate, a WTO delegate from a prominent developing country said to me about circular solutions for computers, computer equipment, and phones. And that is that if developing countries become the home for these second life goods in that sector, then their economies are at a technological disadvantage compared to developed economies. The third observation is demanding circular standards of the type that we're seeing in places like the European Union will not work for many developing countries. Think just about something like minimum recycled content. Most countries don't have the recycling capacity to produce the recycled content that you would need to meet those standards. So you risk a circular divide. And that actually creates resistance in some trade officials to circular solutions. So it's a problem that we have to fix. We need better information to understand what the problem is exactly, and we need better international cooperation. Now, trade policy has often been used to try to bridge economic divides. So we could use it again to try to bridge circular economic divides. And the tools that have often been used are things like capacity building, improving finance flows, and allowing for delayed compliance. And again, I want to pick up on something that was said in the first session, the word partnerships. Super important at the corporate level, but also at the international level. Developing global partnerships to find circular solutions.
Thanks a lot, Nick. And I'm going to stay with you on something that you mentioned on recycling requirements also. Our third solution area that we have developed, it's called Trusted Trader Programs. Many of you must have heard of it. It's also known as Green Lanes, Authorized Economic Operators, many names for the same thing. These would involve a bilateral or regional arrangement between two governments to safely trade or to safely move across borders hazardous or equivalent materials destined for recycling or being put back into the system. Nick, can you tell us a bit more about this concept and what should we need to do to further develop it?
Yeah, thanks, Jeet. So I was going to start with a definition of what are trusted trader programs, but Jeet's just given it to you. So it's customs procedures. In this case, it's to facilitate the cross-border movement of material for recycling. Okay, from a circular perspective, this sounds really good. But you may be surprised to learn that this is actually a topic that is extremely emotive and prompts heated debate. So why is there heated debate around this idea of trusted trader programs, trade for recycling? The reason is because we're talking very often about hazardous waste. And hazardous waste poses risks in transit, but also in the country of arrival. And of course, the backdrop to trade in hazardous waste is that developed countries have all too often exported their hazardous waste to developing countries, not for recycling, but for disposal in places where there isn't the capacity to dispose of it in an environmentally sound manner. And that has led to environmental problems in developing countries. So this is a topic that is very sensitive. So why then should we be trying to promote trade in this hazardous material? And that's a question that many people ask. The reason is, of course, again, recycling. We need recycling for circularity, and we face barriers. We all know that there is very limited capacity globally for recycling. We also know that because of issues of scale, we will not be able to recycle all goods in all places. And so trade in hazardous waste, giving it a value as a material that can be recycled, has circular benefits. So what we want to try to do is achieve those benefits whilst minimizing the risks. So how could we do that? How can we benefit from this trade without posing the risks? The answer is a trusted trader program. And it's a trusted trader program which has very demanding terms and conditions with the right checks and balances to ensure that waste is being moved when it should be moved because there is no capacity to recycle in the country of exportation. And it's being moved to a place where it will be recycled in an environmentally sound manner. And we need to have verification to ensure on both sides that the situation is as described. We also need to try to streamline the procedures around this to facilitate this trade. You're probably familiar with the Basel Convention, which has extremely demanding procedures for movement of hazardous materials. We can do better than the Basel Convention to try to streamline this trade, and there is space within the Basel Convention to allow for this, for small groups of countries to come together to try to put in place procedures that have the right terms, conditions, checks, and balances, but are also properly streamlined, giving the authorities the right role and with appropriate deadlines. To circle back to what I was saying at the beginning, what we need to bring to this debate is not just ideas, but concrete proposals of things we can do to move the needle. And this is a really good example in trade policy of something that we could do to move the needle.
Thanks a lot, Nick. That was wonderful context setting for what trusted trader entails. And we do have a blueprint for it, a non-hazardous cross-border movement of goods. And that brings me to you, Gail. What are the lessons from trade facilitation that already exist that can be applied to trusted trader for hazardous recycling?
Okay, I think a lot of what Nick has said already touches on this because, of course, you're talking about something that's far higher risk to the environment, to health, than the usual things that we deal with on a customs side with authorised economic operators and other trusted trader programs, where you're only looking at revenue risk. Important, but not as critical. So this trust factor is the big thing, and the barrier to becoming a trusted trader should reflect this. The level of stringency in the checks should reflect this. It's no good saying, oh, actually, they weren't as trustworthy as we thought, and we should probably not have inspected all of those after you've got groundwater contamination or after you have a major fire in a recycling plant or something like this. So the level of trust you need to set up is high. And the other thing is you're talking about trusted trader programs that are global. So how do you develop that trust between countries as well? So if I'm in a country over here and I say I have this wonderful trusted trader program for my exporters of hazardous waste and they're all certified, well, the country over here that's receiving that waste needs to know it can trust me and that my programs are sound and that the goods coming from goods I've authorised as trusted traders will be clean and proper and have met all the checks and regulations for sorting and controls and transport. So building trust on many, many levels and making sure that there is an understanding that companies need to maintain that level of trust because companies change, personnel change, practices change. So you've got to be able to ensure that you have the proper procedures in place to ensure that companies maintain that level. And I think finally, if this is voluntary, if you can trade in hazardous waste without being part of this trusted trader program, then what's the incentives? So if companies spend the time and money to become part of a trusted trader program, what's the benefits? Because it's important. I mean, we're talking about entities that are commercial entities that are making a living. There needs to be some incentive, if it is voluntary, for them to meet the standards that are necessary to be a trusted trader. So I think this is the primary ones.
Thanks, Gail. I think I'm going to ask you also rapid-fire questions because I had a lot of fun with the panelists in the previous round on that. So Nick, I'm going to start with you. So for those of you who don't know, Nick and I stay in the same city, but we're on two different sides of the lake. Somehow we run into each other and we have 30 seconds. Nick, what would be your key messages for trade policymakers?
The world will not wait. Trade policy, I think, often moves slowly. We need a circular transition that happens much more quickly than the way policy typically moves. So get up to speed on what circularity is and understand what you have to do and do it and be brave.
Thanks a lot. And I think it's really good that we keep going back to Your Highness's call to be brave. Gail, let's say I meet you and Julie for lunch in Brussels and we're waiting for our fries to arrive. We just have 30 seconds. What will your message be?
Pretty much exactly the same. If policymakers don't speed up the pace of discussion, business will take the lead, which is good. But what happens then is we risk ending up with a fragmented system, which is very, very hard then to tie together into a global system. And we need global action. So policymakers need to talk with trade. They need to talk with the implementing administrations like customs taxation. They need to get in a wide range of people. They need to talk to the standards making organisation and just make it happen. There was a wonderful quote from the last one in the opening address that circular economy policy is stuck in the future. Well, we want it to be in the present. We need to actualise that policy. We need to get it on the ground. And it won't be perfect when we start, but even if you start small, it starts building that momentum. But start small, but start consistently, so we don't end up with a fragmented system.
Thanks a lot. I think, Nick, you have another point to make.
Yeah, I wanted just, because the question was, what would I say to trade policymakers? But this isn't a room full of trade policymakers. This is a room full of circular economy people. So what would I say to you is, having heard what I would just say to trade policy people, you can help by breaking things down. And this was where I started. There's loads of ideas. There's loads of aspiration. what we need to do is to break that down into bite-sized chunks and feed that to trade policymakers and regulators of different stripes, because that's what they digest. And so our role, I think, is to make this an easier pathway for them to implement and to figure out what they can do with the minimum necessary regulatory changes. Because the more complicated the regulatory changes, the longer this will take. And you need business as well, because I think one of the real differences in this debate between civil society and business is that civil society is great at coming up with ideas. Business understands the practical problems, and we need to put them together, which is why forums like this are so valuable, because they can help map the bite-sized steps that we need to take.
Thanks a lot. And actually, my exercise of asking you both these questions is a lazy tactic of letting you summarize the panel without me having to do the difficult job. We have had a fascinating discussion. A huge thanks to all our panelists and Your Highness for the wonderful interventions that you have had. And this gives us a very hefty homework to my team and I to go back, work on these solutions, and then communicate them in public-private platforms like this, and then take these forward. I realize that we are on time, and I do not want to be between you and lunch, but I would be a really bad Indian if I do not thank certain people. Special mention to my colleagues, Kimberly Botwright, Taylor Clayton, and Roshin Green, who have been working with us on these solutions. Malina Sell from Foreign or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's been very supportive of us. Jack Barry, Patrick Schroeder from Chatham House, and Anne-Marie Paget from Caterpillar. Thanks a lot. I think you have fed in enormously to this session. And a final word of thanks to colleagues from Citra and Nordic Innovation for this wonderful opportunity. Thanks a lot.